3 million people watched in silence as a white official told Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to go back to Africa. It happened in a room built for law, but what followed shook the conscience of a nation. Because Jasmine didn't raise her voice, she raised a folder. 47 pages. Cold, unflinching proof, held by a black woman who refused to blink. And in that moment, something cracked. Not just inside the hearing room, but inside the American myth that justice is blind. What happens when the truth enters the room, not in fury, but in silence? Not as a shout, but as a reckoning? This is a dramatized retelling based on real social tensions, public reactions, and historical patterns of injustice in the U.S. While the characters and events may be fictionalized for narrative purposes, the emotions and the questions they raise are painfully real. Because sometimes fiction is the only way to tell a truth too uncomfortable to say out loud. And tonight, that truth is standing in heels, staring down power, and turning silence into a weapon of change. It began at exactly 9:03 a.m. The hearing room, officially labeled 4A, was already over capacity. The wood-paneled walls, polished to a military shine, seemed to press in tighter than usual. Sunlight cut through the frosted glass in jagged shafts. Reporters hunched over their recorders. Committee aides held their breath over keyboard strokes. Even the C-SPAN cameras, those blinking, dispassionate machines, seemed to sense that something unscripted was about to happen. And then it did. Pam Bondi leaned forward. She didn't slam a fist. She didn't raise her voice. She simply tilted the microphone closer and, with the clinical tone of someone delivering a closing argument, said, "Maybe you should go back to Africa and study your roots before trying to lecture us on justice." The silence that followed didn't sound like silence. It sounded like air leaving the room. A young black staffer blinked and looked down. A woman in the gallery froze mid-sip, her paper coffee cup trembling in her hand. One of the sound techs, off-camera, off-duty, muted his own mic without realizing. Even the chairman's gravelly throat-clear, a habitual tick went missing. Because everyone knew what had just happened, but no one knew what was about to. Across from Bondi, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Not an inch, not a muscle. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded gently over a leather folder that had been resting untouched for the past 30 minutes. Her eyes didn't widen, her lips didn't twitch, her breath remained even. The only shift was in her silence. It thickened. She was the only person in that room who didn't flinch. And that's exactly what made the room flinch harder. Viewers watching the live broadcast saw it. They didn't hear an explosion, but they felt the tremor. It wasn't in the words themselves. It was in the way Jasmine didn't respond. Not yet. That pause, that unbearable quiet, was more charged than any rebuttal. Why wasn't she speaking? Why wasn't she lashing back? Why wasn't she defending herself? And more importantly, what was she waiting for? Because something was coming. Jasmine slowly lifted her gaze. Not sharply, not dramatically, just a deliberate movement, like someone opening a page they had bookmarked long ago. Her eyes met Bondi's and held, but still she said nothing, at least not yet. The live comment threads online exploded. Did she just say what I think she said? Why is nobody stopping the hearing? Is Jasmine okay? Oh my God, she's not blinking. She's gonna destroy her. Wait for it. The tension wasn't just in the room, it was across the country, coiling itself into living rooms, phones, classrooms, coffee shops. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning, and it hadn't even started. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't opened her folder. Not yet. But when she did, it wouldn't be noise. It would be proof. And by the time she finished, no one in that room, not Pam Bondi, not the press, not the millions watching at home, would ever forget the silence before the storm. Jasmine Crockett didn't reach for the mic. She didn't glance at the chairman. She didn't even look to the camera crews now adjusting their zoom to frame her face. Instead, she blinked once, slowly, purposefully, and let the silence stretch just long enough to become unbearable. Every second that passed was a second where the insult sat in the center of the room like a foul scent no one dared name. That was the power of it, not in what had been said, but in the fact that everyone had heard it, and yet only one woman was expected to fix it. Her stillness was not resignation. It was strategy. The kind of strategy carved from years of sitting in courtrooms where her clients' lives depended on her ability to stay calm when everything around her was on fire. She had learned a long time ago that the loudest person in the room rarely won. It was the one who made the silence work for them. Pam Bondi shifted slightly, adjusting the lapel of her blazer, clearly expecting a burst of indignation, a headline-ready meltdown. It didn't come. What came instead was something far more dangerous. Focus. Jasmine's expression remained unreadable, but not empty. It held the kind of restraint that makes people nervous. The kind that says, I'm not reacting, I'm calculating. And she was. Because Jasmine hadn't just come to the hearing to defend herself or her community. She had come with something most people in power fear more than confrontation: documentation. Not opinions, not emotions, not slogans. Receipts. She had studied the reports, annotated them, underlined the data, highlighted the footnotes. The folder beneath her hand didn't contain anger. It contained evidence. Yet she waited. She let the room sit in the discomfort. She let America squirm. She wanted them to feel it. The weight of those words, the historic echoes behind them. Go back to Africa. It wasn't just a line. It was a legacy. A phrase soaked in centuries of displacement, of stolen names and stolen land, of shackled ancestors who never got to finish their sentences because someone else had always decided for them what they were worth. Jasmine had heard those words before, maybe not always out loud, but in boardrooms where she was the only one who looked like her, in courtrooms where her motions were dismissed before they were even read, in campaign stops where people smiled at her like she was lucky just to be in the room, and in whispers, always in whispers, until now. And that's what made this moment different, because this time, the insult hadn't been whispered behind closed doors. It had been delivered into a government-issued microphone, amplified across state lines, broadcast live to a nation already fraying at the seams. And Jasmine had been given a choice: to meet fire with fire or to meet ignorance with information. She chose the latter, but she wasn't rushing. She understood something the others didn't. When history gives you a stage, don't perform. Deliver. At last, her hand moved, just a few inches, to rest squarely on the folder's clasp. Not opening it yet, just claiming it. The gesture alone made a few people sit forward in their chairs, almost reflexively. Across the aisle, a committee member reached for his water glass and missed. A reporter uncrossed her legs as if bracing for impact. Even the chairman leaned in slightly, the kind of movement that says, this is no longer procedural. Still, Jasmine said nothing, but her silence now spoke louder than any gavel. It said, you tried to erase me with one sentence, but I brought 47 pages of truth. And when I speak, it won't be for applause. It will be for record, for history, for everyone who never got to speak before me. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room was already listening. Her fingers unclasped the folder gently, but she didn't open it. Not yet. Her gaze remained fixed on Pam Bondi. And then, with the stillness of a surgeon preparing an incision, she finally spoke. I was born in Texas, she began, voice steady, controlled. My father wore the uniform of this country, served under a flag that didn't always serve him. My mother was a nurse. She treated patients who sometimes looked her in the eye and sometimes didn't, but she helped anyway. The room didn't move. Chairs didn't creak. Breaths were shallow, ears sharp. Something was unfolding, something that didn't require yelling to shake the walls. That's how I was raised, Jasmine continued, to serve, to work, to believe in a country that, more often than not, told people like us we were asking for too much just by existing with pride. She took a pause, not for effect, but for breath, because what came next wasn't scripted. It wasn't a rebuttal. It was memory. But my story doesn't begin with my parents, she said. It begins with the ones who never got to tell theirs. My ancestors didn't apply for visas. They didn't book a flight. They were dragged here, chained, branded, auctioned, dehumanized. And for generations, they were told they weren't real citizens, not even real people. A reporter's pen stopped moving mid-sentence. A cameraman off to the side forgot to zoom. But they endured, they built, they gave birth to us. They taught us to walk through fire without raising our fists, to fight battles with paper and evidence and unshakable truth. Then she looked directly at Pam Bondi again, her tone unshaken. "You want me to go back to Africa?" Jasmine asked, the room tightening once more. "Let me tell you something." And now her voice dipped lower, not quieter, but heavier. "My family's blood is in this soil, long before your ancestors signed their first mortgage, long before your laws let us vote, long before your textbooks pretended we didn't exist. We were here. We're still here. And I am not the guest." There was no gasp, no outburst, only wait. Jasmine's words didn't fly through the air. They dropped like bricks, each one building something unmovable. "You don't get to ask me to leave a house that was built on the backs of people who never got to live in it," she said. "I don't owe you my silence. I don't owe you my story. But I'll give it anyway, because you clearly never learned it." And with that, she finally opened the folder. A single sheet sat on top. Bold header, red stamp, date circled. She didn't read it yet, but she let the room see it, because in that moment, Jasmine wasn't just answering an insult. She was placing history back on the table and daring the world to look. Before there was a folder, before there were hearings and headlines and hashtags, there was a little girl in South Dallas who watched the world from the steps of a weather-worn porch. Jasmine Crockett grew up between church bells and sirens, in a neighborhood where dreams had to be louder than the gunshots that sometimes cracked the evening air. Her house was small but sturdy, painted a faded yellow that peeled at the edges, and her mother always said it stood only because her father's hands had put every nail in place. Her father, a U.S. Army veteran, had served in Desert Storm. He didn't talk much about the war, not to her, not to anyone, but every morning, like clockwork, he'd rise before dawn, shine his boots, and fold the American flag he kept in the hallway cabinet as if it were glass. Jasmine would watch him, not understanding the ritual, but feeling the reverence. "We serve a country that forgets us," he once told her, "so we remember each other." Her mother was a nurse, worked double shifts at Parkland Hospital, came home smelling like antiseptic and peppermint gum. There were nights Jasmine would pretend to sleep just to watch her mother wash her hands for what felt like 10 full minutes at the kitchen sink, scrubbing the sorrow from someone else's tragedy off her skin. She treated everyone, white, black, rich, unhoused, like they all bled the same because they did. School was its own battlefield. Jasmine was often the only black girl in her advanced classes. She remembered vividly the teacher who asked her if she was sure she belonged there, and the boy in 8th grade who told her that her skin looked like it had been burned too long in the sun. But she also remembered the librarian who slipped her a copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X and told her, "Some books are meant to find you at the right time." It wasn't one moment that turned Jasmine into a fighter. It was the accumulation of 1,000 quiet insults, of closed doors, of lowered expectations disguised as compliments. "You're so well-spoken. You don't sound like you're from around here. You're not like the others." And it was her grandfather, a janitor who walked 2 miles to work every morning and still wore a tie because a man should never look like he's beneath the room he cleans. At age 12, Jasmine watched the Rodney King verdict from a scratchy couch in her uncle's living room, surrounded by cousins and neighbors in grief. She didn't understand the legal jargon, but she understood the rage. That was the first time she said out loud, "I want to be a lawyer." Her aunt laughed gently. "Then you'd better learn to speak with fire and smile like you mean it." And so she did. The South didn't just raise Jasmine, it tested her, sharpened her, and dared her to dream beyond its boundaries. But it also taught her grace. Sunday dinners with sweet tea and folded napkins. Choir rehearsals where the harmonies rose like prayers. Block parties where elders told stories you weren't allowed to interrupt. That mix of heat and hope, of scars and scripture, became her foundation. And by the time she left Dallas for law school, she wasn't just carrying ambition. She was carrying legacy. Jasmine didn't fall in love with the law because of television courtroom dramas or shiny political ambitions. It found her in the quiet spaces, between textbooks and street corners, between protests and promises made by teachers who couldn't look her in the eye when grading her A papers. Law to her was never just a profession. It was protection. It was language. It was armor. And when she walked into her first law school lecture hall, fresh out of undergrad, clutching a secondhand backpack and a folder full of financial aid forms, she didn't feel like she belonged, but she knew she had to stay. It was the kind of place that liked its black students quiet and grateful. Jasmine was neither. The first time she raised her hand to challenge a professor's argument on prosecutorial discretion, the room went so silent it felt like oxygen had been cut off. The professor smirked and asked her to back up her claim with precedent. She did, cited it line by line. His smirk faded, but the temperature in the room didn't rise. No applause, no nods. Just an invisible line she had dared to cross, now freshly marked. But Jasmine didn't cross that line to be seen. She crossed it because too many others had been told to stay behind it. And slowly, she learned the terrain. She memorized cases like others memorized lyrics. She studied not just what judges said, but what they implied, what they omitted, how their language wrapped bias in legalese. And in study groups, when classmates tiptoed around issues of race, she brought it to the center of the table, daring anyone to challenge the numbers she brought with her. Her first internship was with a public defender's office in a city where poor defendants were pushed through court like paperwork. That summer changed her, not because of the cases, but because of the faces. Teenagers in handcuffs for riding stolen bikes they didn't know were stolen. Mothers charged with resisting arrest for crying too loud when their sons were tackled. Grandfathers cited for loitering 5 feet from their own porches. Jasmine sat beside them all. And while the other interns watched, typed, observed, she listened. And they remembered. There was one case she never forgot. A 19-year-old named Malik had been accused of assaulting an officer outside a convenience store. The security footage showed he'd only raised his hands. The cop lunged. Malik flinched. That was enough. The prosecutors offered a plea deal. 6 months if he confessed, 5 years if he didn't. His mother wept in the hallway, holding a Bible too tightly to open. Jasmine asked to review the footage herself. She spotted detail missed by everyone. The officer had radioed in, "No resistance," seconds before backup arrived. She flagged it, filed it. The case fell apart. Malik walked out free. The next day, he left a crumpled note on Jasmine's desk. "You made them see me." That moment didn't make her feel powerful. It made her feel responsible. Because the law hadn't chosen her to win cases. It had chosen her to witness, to push back, to question everything that was handed to her with a seal and a smile. And that weight never left her, not in school, not in court, and certainly not in Congress. The courtroom wasn't just where she argued. It was where she learned how silence could be louder than rage, and how truth, when delivered calmly, could turn even the coldest transcript into testimony. The night before the hearing, Jasmine Crockett didn't rehearse a speech. She didn't stand in front of a mirror reciting lines, nor did she pace the floor like a politician polishing a performance. She did what she always did before something that mattered. She sat still. Alone in her townhouse office, surrounded by manila folders, flagged reports, and a coffee mug half full of tea gone cold, Jasmine let the quiet stretch out like a blanket. No music, no distractions, just the weight of everything she had gathered and everything she could not afford to forget. Outside, the wind tapped against the window pane, low and uneven. Inside, the only sound was the gentle shuffle of paper and the slow, deliberate breaths of a woman preparing for war, with no armor but facts. She wasn't afraid of Pam Bondi. What haunted her was something harder to name, the possibility that the truth wouldn't matter, that she could show up, say everything, and still be dismissed with a smirk and a headline that read, "Congresswoman overreacts." That's why the folder mattered. It wasn't just evidence, it was protection. Each page marked with a yellow tab was a shield. Each highlighted paragraph, a weapon forged in silence. She had read them all, over and over, not because she didn't know them, but because she needed to remember how they felt. Cold data, lives flattened into charts, Sentencing disparities, police reports, internal memos with words like optics and election pressure. Jasmine had learned to read between the lines where bias lived quietly, hiding in plain sight behind bureaucratic tone. She ran her hand over the cover of the report, whispering the title aloud just once. Department of Justice Internal Audit, Florida Office of the Attorney General, 2018. Then she closed her eyes. Not to rest, but to remember. She remembered a man named William who'd spent 11 months in jail waiting for a trial that never came. A mother named Clarissa who lost custody of her child because her public defender was overworked and underprepared. A boy named Isaiah who ran from a traffic stop because his cousin had once been shot for staying still. None of them were in the room with her, but they would be tomorrow, and that was enough. She took one more breath, deep and anchored. There was no fire in her chest, not anymore. Just a heat low in her gut, a kind of quiet fire that didn't rage, didn't panic. It just burned steady. It told her, don't flinch, don't shout. Let the evidence speak. And when they interrupt you, don't rise. Rise later. Rise when the silence is loud enough for the truth to land. She stood slowly, folded the folder closed, and laid it beside her blazer. The hearing would begin in less than 10 hours. But Jasmine had already made her opening argument, to herself. And it wasn't a speech, it was a promise. The folder didn't snap open. There was no dramatic flourish, no pounding of fists. Just the subtle sound of cardstock creaking as Jasmine Crockett opened it. Slow, deliberate, like someone unwrapping something sacred. Inside, a single sheet sat on top, a gray cover page stamped diagonally in red. Confidential, DOJ, Florida, 2018. Her fingers didn't tremble as she lifted it, but around her the air did. Pam Bondi straightened slightly in her chair, the way someone does when they recognize something they didn't expect to see again. Something they hoped had been buried. Jasmine didn't acknowledge her. She didn't even look at her. She was no longer speaking to Bondi. She was speaking to the record. This document, Jasmine began, her voice measured, calm, was submitted to the U.S. Department of Justice during the final year of Pam Bondi's tenure as Attorney General of Florida. It is not my opinion. It is not hearsay. It is a federal analysis, commissioned, compiled, and signed under oath. She held it at waist height, letting the title page catch the overhead light. Then she turned to the first tab page, where yellow highlights bled through like wounds. The courtroom-sized hearing room had gone dead quiet again, but this time it wasn't fear that silenced them. It was anticipation. Jasmine wasn't reacting anymore. She was reconstructing the moment, turning an insult into indictment. She read without raising her tone, as if the numbers were loud enough. According to this audit, Black defendants in Florida were sentenced to prison terms that were, on average, 32% longer than their white counterparts, for the exact same charges. She paused, not for applause, not for response, just long enough to let the weight of those numbers settle into the cracks between the marble columns and committee chairs. Same crime, same courtroom, same judge, sometimes, but wildly different outcomes. She turned to the next tab. This section details charge upgrades. Prosecutors demonstrated a documented pattern, this is their language, not mine, of escalating charges when the defendant's last name appeared African or Hispanic in origin. That means the name itself, not the facts, determined the path of prosecution. Across the room, aides who had been typing notes now sat frozen. One congressional staffer dropped his pen, but no one turned to look. The only eyes that mattered were the ones locked on Jasmine, and the folder she now held like a scalpel. She continued, her tone unwavering, her expression locked in a quiet kind of fury that didn't boil. It seared. The audit covers 114 cases from the years 2015 through 2018. In 73 of them, the charges recommended by the prosecution were increased based solely on defendant identity, not behavior, not evidence. The words weren't angry, but they were precise, each one sharpened by preparation and history. And here, she said, thumbing one final page, is a notation from Bondi's own office, written by a senior legal advisor during an internal briefing. There is pressure from upper leadership to crack down harder on minority suspects, especially in election years, in order to maintain support from the base. That was the moment the hearing changed. Not because Jasmine shouted, she didn't. Not because she made it personal, she hadn't. But because she had taken the very system that had tried to silence her and made it confess on the record. Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't need to. The room had shifted. The attention no longer belonged to the committee chair, or to Bondi, or even to the cameras blinking red at the back. It belonged to the page, page after page of carefully documented truth. She turned to the next tab, her thumb pausing just above the yellow highlight that sliced across the chart like a warning flare. "Let's be clear," she said, her voice unshaken. "These aren't hypotheticals. These are human lives." She pointed gently to the data set on the open page, raising it just enough for the front row of the gallery to glimpse the bar graph. Case ID 1182, a 22-year-old black male charged with possession of a controlled substance. First offense, sentenced to 14 months in prison. She paused, flipped the page. Case ID 1196, a 24-year-old white male, same charge, also first offense, sentenced to 6 months probation. No gas, just breath held. Jasmine glanced up, not to perform, but to press the room into remembering that these weren't just numbers. These were names, faces, families. "We tell ourselves the system is fair because it has rules," she continued, her tone still gentle, but sharper now. "But what good are rules if they bend for some and break others?" She moved to the next tab, fingers steady. Case ID 1249, a Hispanic mother of 3, arrested for disturbing the peace during a traffic stop where her brother was the driver. She raised her voice. That was enough. Prosecutors elevated the charge to obstruction. She lost custody for 4 months. There was a stiffness in the air now. Not tension, but shame. The kind that creeps in when silence becomes complicit. Jasmine didn't let up. Case ID 1305, a black teenager stopped outside a grocery store. Wrong place, wrong time. Fit the description. He spent 2 nights in jail. Charges dropped. But he missed a college admissions deadline because he didn't have access to his email while detained. No charges, but a door closed anyway. She closed the file just slightly, fingers resting on its spine like it was sacred. And then she looked around, not for applause, not for permission, but for acknowledgement. "These numbers aren't just failures," she said. "They're fingerprints, evidence of a system that doesn't malfunction. It performs exactly as it was designed to." Her voice didn't rise, but it deepened, carrying the weight of not just her own pain, but that of everyone she had ever defended. Every person who had ever sat across from her with cuffs around their wrists and fear in their eyes. "I have stood beside men who couldn't afford a lawyer, women who were told to take plea deals they didn't understand, children who learned the word sentence before they learned how to vote." She opened the folder again. One last chart. 87% of wrongful arrests between 2015 and 2018 occurred in predominantly Black or Latino neighborhoods. 87%. She let the number sit. Of those, fewer than 5% received any formal apology. 0 received restitution. 0. Then softly she added, "And we still call this justice." No one moved. No one shuffled papers. Even the cameras, robotic and automatic, seemed to hold their breath. In this moment, Jasmine wasn't just a congresswoman reading from a file. She was a mirror, and no one in that room liked what they saw. Jasmine paused, one hand still resting on the folder, the other flat on the table. The pages inside no longer needed to speak. They had done their job, exposing numbers, patterns, names. But the room, for all its grandeur and procedural coldness, still needed something else. Not more data, not more law, a sentence. She looked up slowly, not to the committee chair, not to the cameras, but directly at Pam Bondi, who hadn't spoken a word since Jasmine began reading. Her arms were crossed, her jaw clenched, but her eyes, they moved, back and forth, flickering, like someone trying to calculate the cost of losing the room without losing face. Jasmine didn't give her a warning. She simply said it. "You told me to go back to Africa." A stillness fell again, colder this time. Jasmine's tone was soft, almost conversational, but the words fell with weight. Not thrown, dropped, deliberately, unmistakably. Maybe you should go back and read the documents from the country you helped run. There it was. The room didn't gasp. It exhaled, one collective breath released by 100 lungs that hadn't realized they were holding it. Somewhere in the back, a staffer whispered something inaudible. A reporter blinked hard, then started typing furiously. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She didn't follow the moment with another blow. She let it live. That one sentence didn't insult. It indicted. It didn't lash out. It called in. And in doing so, it flipped the entire dynamic. Because in that instant, Jasmine wasn't the one under scrutiny anymore. Bondi was. Not because of a title or a tweet, but because of a record, her own, laid bare by someone who didn't come to fight her, but to confront the silence she had used as cover. Jasmine leaned back slightly, her hands still calm, her breathing still slow. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't angry. If anything, she looked resolved, like someone who had trained not to win an argument, but to tell the truth in a way that could not be erased. The chairman didn't speak. Neither did Bondi. For a moment, even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to zoom in on Jasmine's face or the folder still resting in front of her. But it didn't matter, because the moment had already escaped the room. It was already being clipped, posted, shared. It was on its way to TikTok, to Twitter, to news broadcasts, to classrooms and living rooms. Not because it was loud or theatrical, but because it was clear. So painfully, undeniably clear. And in that clarity, something had cracked, not just a narrative, but a system that had survived for too long on the assumption that no one would say what needed to be said. Jasmine had said it. Now the country would have to decide what to do with the echo. The hearing ended, but the silence didn't. It followed people out of the chamber, down the marble hallways, past the velvet ropes and reporters still too stunned to raise their voices. Even as Jasmine quietly gathered her folder and walked out without a single glance back, the air still buzzed, not with noise, but with something electric and invisible. The kind of current you only feel after a storm, when the sky is too clear for comfort. A congressional aide had captured the moment on their phone. Shaky, off-center, raw. No filters, no commentary. Just Jasmine standing with one hand on the folder, the other at her side, eyes locked onto Bondi's, delivering a line that would soon be carved into political memory. Maybe you should go back and read the documents from the country you helped run. The clip went up at 11:27 a.m. By noon, it was being retweeted by political staffers and law students. By 2 p.m., it had crossed 1 million views. And by 5 p.m., it had been seen 3 million times across TikTok, X, YouTube, Facebook, and even forwarded via text message to relatives who rarely open news links but needed to see this. What made the clip go viral wasn't just the confrontation. It was the silence that wrapped around it. People weren't just watching the video. They were watching each other react to it. The way Jasmine didn't yell, the way she didn't flinch, the way her words fell like quiet thunder in a building designed to ignore soft voices. Cable news shows scrambled to find angles. One anchor called it the moment the room lost its balance. A legal analyst on another channel said, this wasn't testimony, this was cross-examination, and Bondi never even got to object. Online, the commentary ranged from stunned admiration to emotional confession. A retired Marine posted the video with the caption, "This wasn't an argument, it was a bullet through every lie I was taught to believe about justice." A public school teacher from Milwaukee stitched the clip into a TikTok with tears in her eyes. I've waited 30 years to hear someone say it like that. Calm, clear, unapologetic. I showed this to my students today, and not one of them looked away. And in Ohio, a black father posted a video of his son watching the clip silently. When it ended, the boy asked, "Is she a lawyer or a superhero?" The father didn't answer right away. He just said, "She's what courage looks like when it grows up." In barbershops, classrooms, break rooms, and kitchens, people didn't just see Jasmine Crockett. They recognized her because her silence echoed something familiar. The moments when they hadn't been allowed to speak, the slights they had endured, The pain they'd swallowed because raising your voice sometimes means losing the room. And yet she had stayed silent and won it anyway. The hearing had ended, but something larger had begun. Not a trend, a reckoning. And the first sound of it was not applause. It was 3 million people holding their breath. Because for once, someone had spoken the truth so plainly, no one could pretend not to hear it. The lights in room 208 at Oak Ridge Middle School buzzed softly overhead, casting a pale glow over 23 students who, for once, weren't whispering, doodling, or tapping their sneakers against the floor. It was third period, and the air felt unusually thick, like something sacred was about to unfold. At the front of the room stood Ms. Lena Hayward, a history teacher in her 11th year, holding a remote in one hand and a pause screen in the other. On the smartboard behind her was a still image. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, folder in hand, eyes locked forward, frozen mid-sentence. The words "Go back to Africa" weren't written on the screen, but every student in that room already knew they had been said. Ms. Hayward had shown them the clip just once, but it lingered like thunder after a lightning strike. Now, with her thumb hovering above the play button, she looked out at her class. She hadn't planned this. The day's lesson was supposed to be reconstruction. But that morning, while sipping lukewarm coffee at her desk, she'd watched Jasmine Crockett stand her ground in Congress, not by shouting, but by staying completely still. Something in that moment had gripped her heart and refused to let go. So she'd changed the lesson plan. History could wait. This, she thought, was history. The clip resumed. Jasmine's voice returned, not loud, not trembling, but even, firm, unwavering. Maybe you should go back and read the documents from the country you helped run. When the video ended, Ms. Hayward let the silence stretch. It wasn't the awkward kind. It was the kind that asked for respect, the kind that let meaning settle deeper than explanation. Finally, a hand went up. Marcus. Quiet kid, always sat third row, always observing more than speaking. "Is she in trouble for saying that?" he asked. Ms. Hayward considered. "No," she said gently. "Not officially. But sometimes when people tell the truth that clearly, some folks try to make it hard for them." Another hand. Sophia. "Was that other lady in charge of her?" she asked. "The one who said the racist thing?" "No," Ms. Hayward said, shaking her head. "Not anymore. But she used to be. She was the Attorney General of Florida." That answer brought a ripple of reactions, some surprised murmurs, some widening eyes. Then from the back row, Deshawn leaned forward. She said, "Go back to Africa?" Out loud? Like, in Congress? "Yes," Ms. Hayward replied. "On the record. On camera." He shook his head. "My grandma always said, if they don't hit you, they'll try to humiliate you." The room was still again, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Then from the second row, Amaya raised her hand halfway. "She didn't yell," she said. "No," Ms. Hayward agreed. "She didn't." Amaya nodded again. "She could have, but she didn't. That's harder." That line hung in the air like gospel. Ms. Hayward walked slowly to the whiteboard, picked up a dry erase marker, and wrote in bold letters, "Courage isn't the volume of your voice. It's the weight of your truth." She turned back to the class. "I want you to remember what you saw today," she said softly. "Not just what was said, but how it was said. The facts she brought, the way she stood her ground, and the way the entire room changed. Not because she shouted, but because she refused to back down." A few heads nodded. Jamal, usually silent, hoodie up, eyes distant, was sitting upright, watching the screen like it had more to say. And maybe it did. Because in that classroom, far from Capitol Hill, a moment meant for headlines had become a lesson no textbook could match. And no one, not even the students, wanted the bell to ring. It was late afternoon in a quiet Pennsylvania suburb, the kind of day where the sun hits the living room couch just right and the air feels too calm to notice that something is changing. Inside a modest two-story home, a father and son sat shoulder to shoulder, not saying much, not needing to. The television was on, the volume turned down just enough to hear Jasmine Crockett's voice cutting through the silence. The father, early 40s, in jeans and a worn flannel shirt, had seen the clip earlier that day on his phone during a coffee break at work. It had stopped him cold, right in the middle of scrolling through emails and morning noise. Something about it clung to him. He didn't watch political hearings. He didn't know Jasmine Crockett's name before today, but there was something about her stillness, her voice, her restraint. He didn't just want to re-watch it, he wanted his son to see it too. So now they sat together. The boy, 12, legs curled under him, watched closely like the screen was showing something rare, something real. Jasmine's voice echoed through the room, calm, unshaken. Then came the line. Maybe you should go back and read the documents from the country you helped run. The boy didn't speak right away. Neither did the father. They just sat, both staring at the screen, now frozen on Jasmine's face. Serious, focused, unwavering. The boy turned slowly and looked at his dad. She sounds like Grandpa, he said, his voice soft, when he talks about the war. The father's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected that. He turned to look at his son, really look, and something in the boy's eyes told him he understood more than he let on. The father blinked, swallowed, then turned back to the screen. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't screamed, but somehow she had hit harder than anyone he'd seen behind a podium. He cleared his throat. Yeah, he said quietly, she does. Then he reached over and gently placed a hand on his son's back, not to comfort, but to anchor them both to the moment. Later that night, he posted the clip on his social media page. He didn't write a long caption, just one sentence. I watched this with my son, and I'm proud that he cried. The comment section lit up. Thousands responded. Black, white, brown, veterans, teachers, grandparents, teenagers. Not with debates, but with memories. Memories of the first time they heard someone say the thing no one dared say. The truth not dressed up for TV, not polished, not shouted, just said. And it changed everything. Because sometimes what shifts a country isn't a revolution. It's a father and son, sitting quietly, seeing someone brave enough to speak what generations had been forced to carry, and choosing to carry it with her. Pam Bondi sat alone on a cold marble bench in the northeast corridor of the Capitol, far from the cameras, far from the microphones, far from the eyes that had followed her for years with either admiration or suspicion. For the first time in a long time, no one reached for her. Not a single aide came to hand her a water bottle. Not a single colleague leaned over to whisper reassurance. Even the reporters, usually circling like vultures, stayed behind, fixated on someone else. Jasmine had the room now. And Pam had the echo. The hallway was quiet except for the faint hum of recessed lighting and the distant clicks of a cleaning crew preparing for another long night in Washington. The hearing had ended over an hour ago, but time hadn't started again for her. She hadn't planned to sit. She'd only meant to pass through, to exit quickly, regain her balance, maybe find a way to spin what had just happened. But her legs had betrayed her. She'd lowered herself onto the bench as if pulled by gravity too heavy to fight. She stared at the floor, black diamonds on white tile. Simple, repetitive, but suddenly impossibly complicated. Her hands were clasped in her lap, fingers curled too tightly to be calm. Her jaw ached from holding itself firm. She had faced judges before. She had faced scandal. But this was different. She could still hear Jasmine's voice. Not the words exactly. The tone. That unshaken, surgically controlled tone that had pierced through layers of posture and politics and landed where nothing had touched her in years. Inside. Pam had always believed she was built for this. For conflict. For pressure. She had come up through the ranks with fire on her heels and strategy in her teeth, but no strategy had prepared her for this kind of silence. The kind that didn't come from being out-argued, but from being seen too clearly, stripped of defenses, left to sit with the version of herself she had always talked over. No one had offered her a word as she left the chamber. Not even the sympathetic ones. The aides who had once shadowed her moves were gone. Some had peeled off quietly. Others never followed her out at all. Their absence wasn't hostile. It was hollow. It was the kind of absence you don't have to explain. Pam closed her eyes just for a moment, but the silence grew louder behind her lids. She didn't see the audience anymore. She saw her own reflection on the screens, on the live stream, on millions of phones, frozen in time, mouth open mid-retort, then stopped cold by Jasmine's truth. That folder, that voice, that sentence. She tried to remember what she had meant to say next, but it didn't matter now. No one had asked. No one had needed her to clarify, because what was said had already eclipsed what she might have meant. She opened her eyes again, still alone, still unseen, but for the worst reason. Not because she had been silenced, but because she had revealed herself, and no one wanted to look closer. That, she realized, was what it meant to lose not just the room, but the story. And when no one reaches for you in that moment, it isn't because they can't. It's because they no longer want to. Pam didn't hear his name at first. It came like a whisper in the back of her mind, too soft to notice, too old to matter. But then it returned, sharper this time, clearer. Marcus Daniels. And with it came the memory, vivid and uninvited, like a letter she had once refused to open, but could no longer ignore. Her eyes were still on the tiled floor of the Capitol hallway, but her mind was in a parking lot, nearly 25 years earlier, where fear had first met her ambition and almost destroyed it. She had been 22, a second-year law student, broke, proud, and just naive enough to think rules didn't always apply to people like her. She had parked in the wrong lot after hours, university property, faculty only. A wine bottle sat forgotten in her back seat from the weekend before. She hadn't even opened it, but campus security had spotted it through the glass and called the police, citing suspected alcohol possession on school grounds. It could have ended in a citation. It could have ended in nothing, but it didn't. One officer had already begun radioing in her name, asking for student ID, documenting everything. Her hands were shaking, her words stumbled, her stomach twisted as visions of lost internships, disciplinary hearings, and career-ending black marks rushed through her head like sirens. And then, through the shadows of panic, a voice called out, "Pam!" She turned. It was Marcus Daniels, one of the few black students in her class. Soft-spoken, brilliant, always sat in the back row, always answered questions with quiet clarity that didn't demand attention, but earned it anyway. They weren't friends, barely acquaintances, but he saw her. She told him what had happened, her voice uneven. He didn't judge, didn't smirk, didn't hesitate. "Come with me," he said. Marcus knew one of the officers, his cousin. He walked up to him calmly, explained what had happened, vouched for her character, for her scholarship status, for her future. He didn't plead, he reasoned. He navigated the tension like someone who had done it before, not for himself, but for others. Within 10 minutes, the situation dissolved. No paperwork, no report, just a quiet nod from the officer and a warning to be more careful next time. Pam barely remembered what she said to Marcus afterward. A half smile, a quick, "Thanks, man." Then she walked off, fast, embarrassed, more relieved than grateful. And that was it. She never mentioned it again. Never asked him why he had helped her, never reached out. And within a year, Marcus Daniels had vanished from her radar, buried under the noise of exams, summer clerkships, and ambition. Now sitting on that cold bench, a lifetime later, Pam realized what had haunted her since Jasmine Crockett spoke. She had once been saved by a black man's grace, and she had forgotten him, forgotten his calm, his protection, his voice. And then decades later, she had looked into the eyes of another black voice, firm, grounded, unafraid, and tried to silence it with a phrase no different from the ones whispered behind Marcus's back during law school. "Go back to Africa." Pam closed her eyes, and this time, she didn't see Jasmine. She saw Marcus. Not angry, not accusing, just still. And somehow that silence hurt more than any words ever could. The cursor blinked at the top of a blank screen, steady and patient, like it had all the time in the world. Outside the tall windows of her Florida home, the sun had long sunk beneath the Gulf, leaving the sky a murky gray tinged with orange. Inside, the house was too quiet. No aides, no assistants, no TV murmuring in the background. Just Pam Bondi, alone at her kitchen table, her hands resting on the keyboard, unsure where to begin. She hadn't meant to write anything. Her instinct always had been to control the narrative, issue a press release, book an interview, steer the conversation. But tonight, that playbook felt like a museum artifact. She couldn't spin what had happened. And worse, she couldn't ignore it. Not after seeing Jasmine's face, not after hearing her own voice echo through 100 clips she couldn't unwatch. Her fingers hovered, then slowly they began to move. Congresswoman Crockett, I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not sure I deserve it. She paused. The words already felt heavier than any statement she'd drafted in her career. There were no bullet points, no advisors, no polls to consider. Just a truth that had waited too long. But I want to say what I should have said in that room. What I should have remembered long before this week. There was a time when I was young, unsteady, and in danger of losing everything, that someone who looked like you stepped in and protected me. I never thanked him. I never asked why he helped me. I never even said his name out loud until today. She stopped again. Her chest tightened. I buried that moment because it made me uncomfortable. Because I didn't want to admit that someone else's grace had once saved me before I even knew what grace meant. The cursor blinked again. The draft was quiet, but the air around her felt loud, like something inside her had cracked open. Not broken, just exposed. You didn't humiliate me. You didn't shout. You held up a mirror. And for the first time, I saw myself not as I imagined I was, but as I had become. She leaned back, reading the lines over once. Then she moved the cursor to the top of the screen, clicked Save Draft, and closed the laptop. She didn't send it. Maybe she never would, but she wrote it. And for someone who had spent a lifetime dodging discomfort, that alone felt like a kind of reckoning. Because sometimes the most honest words are the ones you're too afraid to let go. And sometimes silence isn't escape, it's admission. The doors swung open, not with ceremony, but with force. A wave of noise crashed through them instantly. Shutter clicks, overlapping questions, the low murmur of anticipation rising like steam. Jasmine Crockett stepped into the light, not blinking, not breaking stride. Her heels struck the marble floor in quiet rhythm. She didn't scan the crowd. She didn't raise a hand. She simply walked forward, folder in hand, face composed like stone, cut with care. Security walked a few steps behind her, not shielding her, not ushering her, just present. Jasmine didn't need protection. She needed space. And the crowd gave it to her, not out of protocol, but out of something closer to awe. They had seen the clip. They had heard the sentence. They were no longer chasing a reaction. They were chasing meaning. She stopped at the press line. Dozens of microphones, cameras, and faces all turned toward her. The air was alive with electricity. Questions burst from every direction. Congresswoman, do you stand by your statement? Do you believe Pam Bondi should be censured? Do you plan to introduce legislation based on the DOJ report? She didn't answer at first. Instead, she looked directly at the first camera she saw, locked eyes with the lens like it was a person. The crowd stilled. The microphones leaned in. Then calmly, she spoke. Let me be clear, she began. I didn't come into that hearing looking for a fight. I didn't come with a script. I came with the truth. Her voice didn't need volume to carry. It had weight. And weight, as the country had learned, was harder to deny than noise. When I was told, on the record, in a public hearing, to go back to Africa, I had a choice, she continued. I could have responded with anger. I could have left. Or I could do what so many black women in this country have had to do for generations. She paused, letting the silence hang. Stay in the room, stay calm, and speak anyway. The flashbulbs lit up again, slower this time, more reverent than ravenous. What you saw wasn't an attack, Jasmine said. It wasn't even a defense. It was a mirror, a moment where the room had to choose whether it would finally see what has always been there. She lifted the folder slightly, not to wave it, not to dramatize, but to remind them that this wasn't about opinion, it was about record, about a system that had carved disparity into policy and called it neutrality. This isn't about parties, she said firmly. This is about right and wrong. And for those uncomfortable with what I revealed, I invite you not to argue with me, but to read the same documents I did. Reporters scribbled furiously. Others didn't write at all. They just watched. Jasmine looked around the press line one final time, and that she had always known was far more dangerous. After the committee adjourned, an older senator, Republican, conservative, rarely known to acknowledge anything across the aisle, stood behind her in the elevator. He didn't speak at first, just stood silently, briefcase in hand, glancing at the folder she carried. Then as the doors opened, he cleared his throat. "I read it," he said. Jasmine turned her head slightly, curious but composed. "The memo," he added. "I read the whole damn thing." And before she could reply, he stepped out into the hallway and disappeared. No applause, just eyes. Watching. And for Jasmine, that was enough, because silence may not celebrate you, but it remembers. History has a way of forgetting the quiet ones. It favors volume. It rewards spectacle. It archives the loudest voice in the room, not the truest. Somewhere in a textbook years from now, there might be a footnote about a congressional hearing in spring of 2025, a single line buried under committee reports and legislative summaries. It may mention that Representative Jasmine Crockett spoke. It might even note that there was controversy. But it won't tell you how the air shifted. It won't remember the silence between her words. It won't capture the way a nation exhaled when she didn't flinch. But the internet remembers. 6 months later, the video still sat atop millions of playlists, not boosted by paid ads or campaigns, just kept alive by people who needed it. Parents showed it to their kids. Professors included it in ethics lectures. High school students used it in debate competitions. And in church basements, town halls, barbershops, retirement homes, and late-night subway rides, the clip continued to surface. Not because it was viral, but because it was vital. One version of the clip, posted by a 19-year-old college sophomore, had no edits, no commentary, just the raw 87 seconds of Jasmine standing silent, holding the DOJ file and saying, "Maybe you should go back and read the documents from the country you helped run." Under it, she had written, "My mom cried watching this. My grandma said, 'Finally.' I just stood up." It had over 14 million views. But beyond the numbers was something deeper. Comment sections didn't erupt into arguments. They unfolded into reflection. People didn't just post applause emojis. They told stories. Stories of the first time they were silenced, of the time their name changed a job interview, of the moment they realized justice didn't always wear a robe. One woman wrote, "I saved this video for when I forget how to speak without yelling." Even those who once criticized Jasmine found themselves watching it again in private. Because the truth, when spoken without apology, has a way of bypassing defenses. It lingers, it unsettles, and eventually it changes the room, even after the speaker is gone. Somewhere in Oregon, a librarian played it during a community reading night. In Detroit, a marching band choreographed a halftime routine around her speech. In Mississippi, an English teacher asked her students to write a response, not to the insult, but to the restraint. And somewhere in Florida, in a quiet kitchen near the coast, a woman named Pam Bondi played the video once more. Alone. No statements, no rebuttal. Just one hand on her mug, the other on the draft she still hadn't sent. Because what history forgets, the internet remembers. And this time it wasn't the scandal they replayed. It was the silence, the strength, the stillness that made truth impossible to ignore. It didn't happen all at once. There was no headline that read, "Nation changes overnight." No sweeping reform passed in the dead of night. But the shift came, steady and unannounced, in the same way Jasmine Crockett had entered that hearing room. With calm, with conviction, and with an understanding that silence could be weaponized, not just endured. In community centers, people began to speak a little differently. In school board meetings, a single parent would rise, not to yell, but to read policy aloud and ask one clear question: who benefits from this staying the way it is? In city councils, more residents began asking for minutes, not out of routine, but because they had watched someone like Jasmine demand space in a room designed to keep her small and refuse to shrink. "If she can stand there," one pastor in Atlanta said during Sunday service, "then we can speak here. And if they don't listen, we speak again." That line was repeated across pulpits, classrooms, break rooms, even tattooed on a young woman's forearm in cursive script. If she can stand there, we can speak here. It wasn't a slogan. It was a permission slip.